December 1941, outside Moscow, the air is iron and ice. Smoke rises from the burnt-out hulks of German armor, frozen into the snow like tombstones. The trees are skeletal. The sky is the color of lead. General Heinz Guderian stands at the edge of a forest clearing, his breath misting in the bitter cold. Around him, men who once marched singing into Poland now huddle in thin summer uniforms, their faces gray with frostbite and exhaustion. He looks east, towards Moscow, barely 30 miles away. So close, and yet for the first time in this war, utterly unreachable. Guderian turns to his aide and says very quietly, "We have lost the war. Before we continue, if you enjoy cinematic deep dives into history like this, please consider subscribing. It really helps us bring forgotten stories to life." To understand the chill of December 1941, one must remember the heat of June 1940. 18 months earlier, Heinz Guderian had been a hero, the architect of Blitzkrieg, the man who shattered French defenses in 6 weeks and brought the Third Reich to the height of its power. He had done what the Kaiser's armies could not. In 4 years of grinding slaughter, he had rewritten the rules of modern war. But by the winter of 1941, that same man stood in the frozen wastes outside Moscow, watching his army disintegrate, not from lack of courage, not from poor tactics, but from something far more fundamental: reality. The fall of France was not just a military victory, it was a psychological earthquake. For Germany, it erased the humiliation of 1918. For Europe, it seemed to confirm that a new order had arrived, swift, unstoppable, modern. And at the center of that triumph was Heinz Guderian. Guderian was not a Nazi ideologue. He was a professional soldier, methodical, brilliant, and ruthlessly effective. He had pioneered the use of massed armored formations, combined with air support and rapid maneuver. It was his thinking that had turned tanks from support weapons into the spearhead of entire campaigns, and in May 1940, it worked perfectly. Whilst the French High Command expected a repeat of 1914, a slow grind through Belgium, Guderian's tanks burst through the Ardennes forest, a route the French considered impassable for armor. Within days, he had reached the Channel coast. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk. The French army was cut in two. By mid-June, France had surrendered. For Guderian, it was vindication. His theories had been proven. His reputation was unassailable, but there was a problem. Blitzkrieg was designed for short, decisive campaigns, wars of weeks, not years, lightning strikes that shattered the enemy before they could mobilize fully. It had worked in Poland. It had worked in France. But it required two things: speed and a clear endpoint. And in June 1941, Hitler threw both away. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million men, 3,000 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, 2,000 aircraft. The objective: destroy the Red Army in a single summer campaign, occupy European Russia, and force Stalin to surrender before winter. Guderian had his doubts. Not about German superiority, he believed in that absolutely, but about the distances involved. France had been conquered in 6 weeks across 700 kilometers of good roads and railways. The Soviet Union stretched 3,000 kilometers from border to Urals. The roads were dirt tracks. The railways used a different gauge, and there were over 200 Soviet divisions, many of them already east of the Urals, beyond reach. Still, the operation began on 22nd June 1941, and for the first weeks it seemed like France all over again. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands surrendered. The Red Air Force was shattered on the ground in the first days. And by September, Guderian's Panzer Group had taken Kiev and captured over 600,000 prisoners. It was the largest encirclement in history. Hitler declared the war won. Propaganda films showed endless columns of Soviet prisoners dazed and defeated. But Guderian was starting to see something his superiors refused to acknowledge. The Red Army kept fighting. No matter how many divisions were destroyed, more appeared. Siberian troops, factory workers armed and sent to the front, teenagers, old men, and behind them, an industrial base that was relocating entire factories piece by piece beyond German reach. By October, Guderian's tanks were within sight of Moscow's suburbs, but they were exhausted. Half his vehicles were broken down, fuel was running short, ammunition stocks were dangerously low, and then the weather turned. October rains turned the roads into swamps. Trucks bogged down, tanks sank to their turrets. Supply columns ground to a halt, the advance stalled. If you're still watching, you're clearly a history lover. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our next story. By November, the mud had frozen solid. The advance resumed. Guderian's forces closed to within 30 kilometers of the city. Reconnaissance units reported they could see the spires of the Kremlin through their binoculars, but they could go no further. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, froze to death at their posts. Weapons seized up, engine oil turned to sludge. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat losses in some units. And then on 5th of December, 1941, the Soviets counterattacked. Fresh Siberian divisions, men who knew cold, who were equipped for it, smashed into the exhausted German lines, not with sophisticated tactics, but with raw mass and ferocious determination. They came in waves, screaming, dying in heaps, but always coming. Guderian's front began to buckle. For the first time since 1939, German forces were retreating, not conducting an orderly withdrawal, retreating. Entire battalions disintegrated, equipment was abandoned, wounded men were left behind because the trucks wouldn't start. Guderian issued orders to fall back to defensible positions. Hitler countermanded them, no retreat, not one step backwards. Units would hold their ground or die where they stood. It was madness. And Guderian knew it. On 20th of December, he flew to Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia. He intended to explain the situation face to face, to make the Führer understand that holding untenable positions would destroy the army. The meeting lasted 30 minutes. Guderian presented his case with the same methodical precision he'd used in planning offensives. The troops were exhausted. Winter equipment hadn't arrived. Supply lines were stretched beyond breaking. The Soviets were feeding in fresh divisions, whilst Germans' strength dwindled daily. Without a strategic withdrawal to defensible lines, the entire front risked collapse. Hitler listened in silence. Then he stood. His face was rigid. There will be no withdrawal. The army will hold where it stands. If you cannot carry out my orders, I will find someone who can. Guderian tried once more. Mein Führer, the men will do as they are told. 3 days later, Guderian was relieved of command. The official reason was health. Everyone knew the truth. He had committed the unforgivable sin. He had told Hitler the war could not be won, and for Guderian, standing in that frozen forest clearing, watching his panzers burn, the terrible clarity had already come. Not through some dramatic revelation, not through a single catastrophic defeat, but through the slow, grinding realization that they had bitten off more than they could chew. Germany had conquered France with finite resources, but the Soviet Union was not France. It was vast. It was willing to absorb losses that would break any Western nation, And behind the Urals lay an industrial capacity that was just beginning to mobilize. Every German tank destroyed was irreplaceable. Every experienced crew killed was a loss the army couldn't afford. But the Soviets, they lost 5 tanks for everyone they destroyed, and still they came. Guderian did the mathematics, and the mathematics were unforgiving. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with 3 times the population, 10 times the territory, and allies across the Atlantic preparing to join the fight. The only question now was how long it would take and how many would die before the inevitable end. And if you're enjoying this deep dive, a quick reminder, subscribing helps us keep making stories like this every week. Guderian spent the next year in forced retirement, watching from the sidelines as the Eastern Front consumed the Wehrmacht division by division. Stalingrad fell in February 1943. An entire German army, over 90,000 men, marched into Soviet captivity. Barely 5,000 would ever return home. Kursk followed in July. The last great German offensive in the East shattered against prepared Soviet defenses. After Kursk, Germany never again launched a strategic offensive in Russia. In 1944, Hitler recalled Guderian, not to command armies, but as chief of the General Staff. A position of great responsibility, but little actual power. Guderian took it because he believed he might yet save something from the catastrophe, perhaps prevent total annihilation, perhaps negotiate some terms before the Soviets reached Berlin. He couldn't. By 1945, the Reich was collapsing. The Soviets were advancing 20 miles a day. American and British forces were across the Rhine. German cities were rubble. But Hitler issued orders for non-existent armies to launch counteroffensives, refused to evacuate civilians from the path of Soviet forces, spoke of miracle weapons, and turning points that existed only in his imagination. Guderian argued, pleaded, demanded. It made no difference. On 28th of March 1945, after yet another shouting match with Hitler, Guderian was dismissed for the final time. He was sent on convalescent leave. 6 weeks later, Hitler was dead. Germany surrendered. And Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, was sitting in an Allied prisoner of war camp. He was never charged with war crimes. Unlike many senior officers, he'd kept his distance from the Nazi Party's worst atrocities. He'd been a soldier, not an ideologue. That distinction mattered to him after the war. He wrote his memoirs, Panzer Leader. It was published in 1951 and became an international bestseller. Military academies studied his tactics. Historians interviewed him. He became, in a strange way, respectable, the professional soldier who'd simply done his job. But the question lingered, when did he know? In his memoirs, Guderian claimed he'd seen the writing on the wall in December 1941. That moment outside Moscow, watching his army freeze, was when strategic reality overwhelmed ideological delusion. Some historians are skeptical. They point out that Guderian continued to serve, continued to fight, even after that supposed revelation. If he truly believed the war was lost, why didn't he resign? Why didn't he refuse further orders? The answer, perhaps, lies in something more human than heroism or cowardice. He was a soldier. Soldiers follow orders. And beyond that, there was loyalty not to Hitler, whom he despised by 1943, but to the men under his command, to Germany itself, to some notion that even a lost war must be fought with honor, that surrender was inconceivable even when victory was impossible. It's the same paradox that trapped so many of that generation. They knew intellectually that defeat was inevitable, but knowing and accepting are different things. And so they fought on Month after month, whilst cities burned and millions died because the alternative, simply stopping, was psychologically impossible. Guderian lived until 1954. He died at his home in Bavaria, age 65, from heart failure. By then, West Germany was rearming. NATO was debating how to defend Europe from Soviet attack, and young German officers were studying Guderian's theories at military academies once again. The Blitzkrieg tactics he'd pioneered were being absorbed into NATO doctrine. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's new army, considered him a founding father. His reputation was, if not rehabilitated, at least separated from the regime he'd served. But the question remains, the one Guderian himself never fully answered. If you know a war is lost, what do you do if you're a general responsible for thousands of lives and you realize that every battle from this point forward is merely postponing the inevitable? Do you fight on? Do you resign? Do you sabotage your own side? Do you surrender? Guderian chose to fight, and tens of thousands died because of that choice. Not because he was a fanatic, but because he was a professional, because he believed, even in defeat, that discipline and duty mattered more than outcome. There's no moral high ground in that story, no redemption, just the terrible grinding logic of war, where good men make choices that lead to catastrophic consequences, and history judges them by standards they never imagined would apply. If you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we make these videos for. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. In the decades since, historians have debated Guderian's legacy endlessly. Was he a military genius whose brilliance was squandered by Hitler's interference, or was he complicit in prolonging a war he knew was lost, thereby multiplying the suffering? The truth, as always, is more complicated than the either narrative allows. Guderian was brilliant. His tactical innovations genuinely revolutionized warfare. Modern combined arms doctrine, tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support working in seamless coordination owes much to his thinking. Armies around the world still study his campaigns, but brilliance in war is not morality. The fact that something works doesn't make it right, and the fact that Guderian saw defeat coming didn't absolve him of responsibility for what came after. He made choices. He stayed when he could have left. He fought when he could have resisted. He obeyed orders when he could have refused. Each decision seemed small at the time. Each seemed justified by duty, by honor, by loyalty to comrades, but the cumulative effect of those small decisions was catastrophic, not just for Germany, but for all of Europe. For every day the war continued past December 1941, thousands died. Soldiers, yes, but also civilians, Jews in death camps, Poles under occupation, Russians in besieged cities, Germans in bombed-out ruins. The question Guderian's story poses is uncomfortable because it implicates all of us. What would you do if you realized your cause was lost, but your duty demanded you continue? When does loyalty become complicity? When does professionalism become moral cowardice? These aren't abstract questions. They apply to every soldier in every war, but also to everyone who's ever faced a choice between what's easy and what's right, between the system you're part of and the principles you claim to hold. Guderian's tragedy, if we can call it that, was not that he failed to see the truth. He saw it clearly. His tragedy was that seeing didn't change what he did. And in that sense, his story isn't really about World War II at all. It's about the human capacity to recognize futility and carry on regardless, to know that what you're doing is wrong or pointless or doomed, and do it anyway, because the alternative is to admit that everything up until now was for nothing. That's the coldest truth of all. December 1941, outside Moscow. The temperature is 40 below. General Heinz Guderian stands in the snow watching his army die. He knows with absolute certainty that Germany has lost this war, that everything from this point forward is merely delay, that the end, when it comes, will be total. And yet, tomorrow morning, he will issue orders. His men will advance. Tanks will roll. Soldiers will fight and die, because that's what soldiers do, even when they know it doesn't matter. For historians, it was a turning point. For those who lived it, it was simply another frozen morning in a war that had long since stopped making sense. Guderian would later write that the moment outside Moscow was when he lost faith in victory. But faith, as it turns out, is easier to lose than momentum. And so the war ground on, not because anyone believed in it, but because no one knew how to stop. That's the real lesson of Heinz Guderian. Not that seeing the truth matters, but that sometimes, even when you see it clearly, you're powerless to act on it. The snow kept falling, the war kept going, and thousands kept dying, not for victory, not even for hope, just because stopping seemed impossible. The irony, of course, is that Guderian was right. Germany had lost the war in December 1941. Everything that followed, Stalingrad, Kursk, D-Day, the fall of Berlin, was merely the slow, agonizing confirmation of what one freezing general had already understood while standing in the Russian snow. But wars don't end when generals realize they're lost. They end when entire nations accept it, and that acceptance cost 3.5 more years, 15 million more dead, cities reduced to ash, a continent in ruins. One man saw the truth early, and it changed nothing. Perhaps that's the darkest lesson of all. That clarity without power is just another form of helplessness, that knowing the future doesn't give you the strength to change it. Guderian died in his bed, age 65, having outlived the Reich by 9 years. He was buried with military honors. Former colleagues attended. Historians sought his wisdom, and the world moved on, having learned his tactics whilst largely forgetting his warning. That warning was simple. Some wars cannot be won, no matter how brilliantly you fight them. Some enemies are too vast, some distances too great, some causes too fundamentally doomed. The tragedy isn't that Germany lost. The tragedy is how long it took and how many died before everyone else realized what Guderian had seen in that frozen forest. The snow fell, the war continued, and the general who knew it was over kept giving orders. Because sometimes the hardest thing to do isn't seeing the truth. It's living with what you see. If this story moved you or made you think differently about history, please share it. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. Not because they're heroic, but because they're human. And we'll see you in the next one.